passengers, this train will terminate at Eltham. Replacement bus service is operating from Eltham to Heidelberg. Metro apologises for any inconvenience.
On platform 2, all change. This train is returning to Hurstbridge. Passengers for the city, please make your way out to the front of the station for replacement bus services
Express to Heidelberg. Express to Heidelberg, anyone? Over here. Ma'am, please stop.
Melbourne, we really need to talk about bus replacements. I reckon I'm probably not alone when I say I like my public transport to be reliable. When we talk about reliability though, we're usually just talking about services running consistently on time, but in this video I want to take a step back and look at reliability in a broader sense. What does it mean for passengers when the service they rely on to get about their daily lives simply isn't there at all when they need it? If you've been a regular user of Melbourne's rail network any time in the last 20 years, at some point you will have been affected by a major disruption to service, probably one that's weeks or even months long. The biggest driver of this has been the level crossing removal project, which has seen the complete rebuild of large sections of the network, but lengthy shutdowns happen for all sorts of other projects too. It's something we now more or less take for granted, that it's okay to shut down a major passenger railway line for weeks at a time in the name of progress. But in this video I'd like to ask the question, is it? What are the actual effects of shutting down an essential transport service for multiple weeks or months, and should we be doing more to prioritise keeping these shutdowns as short as possible? I mean, yes, obviously we should, that's why I'm making this video, and we're also going to have a look at a few things our beloved public transport agency currently does very, very badly during these major disruptions. Quick glossary moment. When a railway is closed for maintenance or construction or whatever, it's called an occupation, or some agencies call it a possession. The meaning is fairly literal. The line is occupied for a certain amount of time by the work taking place, and trains aren't allowed to enter the occupied section. So when I say occupation, I'm talking about the section of line that's closed and also the time frame it's closed for. It might shock some people to hear this, but did you know that major occupations that last more than a single weekend are essentially a 21st century invention? It's not that it never happened before, but it was really, really uncommon. Large-scale bus replacements were just not a thing before the 90s. My mum was a commuter on the Hurstbridge line for a good part of the 1970s, and she doesn't recall any significant shutdowns or ever having to catch a bus at all. You might think that's because there just weren't major infrastructure projects then like we have today, but you'd be wrong about that. In the late 70s, the Hurstbridge line actually had a really major duplication and grade separation project, duplicating 5 kilometres of line between McLeod and Greensborough and lowering about 1.7 kilometres into a cutting, removing 3 level crossings and allowing for the construction of the Greensborough Highway. This was not at all unlike some of the big level crossing removal projects today, and it was done without any significant disruption to the rail service. First, a temporary single-track line was built to the east of the existing ground level alignment, including a temporary Watsonia station. Then the old line was removed and half the new cutting dug out. A new single track was then laid at the bottom, which allowed the removal of the temporary line. Then the other half of the cutting was dug out and the second track laid, completing the duplication. This whole process did take about 3 years, but the people who depended on the line were able to use the train that entire time. I don't actually know for sure if there was a short disruption while the track was disconnected from one alignment and connected to the other, but there are lots of other examples from the time which suggest it was probably just done overnight. The Watsonia project was far from unusual. Here's a view of the line between Clifton Hill and Victoria Park during the construction of the Eastern Freeway Bridge in 1976. The new bridge is being built straight ahead, and that's a temporary deviation running around to the left, keeping trains moving through the works. For a bit of a different example, when the Darebin Viaduct was duplicated in 1951, they widened the existing supports and slid the existing deck over to one side, with the assistance of 200 men with huge jacks, to allow space for the new deck carrying the second track. The deck, along with the track and overhead wiring, was shifted overnight in a 6-hour window, finished in time for the first train the next morning. This kind of thing was normal. Trains were important. Now, I'm very aware that there are some reasons why it was easier to keep trains running through a project back in the 70s. Workplace safety culture was completely different, allowing trains to operate through or alongside work sites in ways they wouldn't be allowed to today, and the railway network was a lot more flexible, with more places to terminate trains or cross over to the opposite track. It was much more common to allow things like temporary wrong line running, where a train crosses over to use the track for the other direction to get around a work site. The buses available in the 70s were also less capable than their modern equivalents, and in places like Watsonia, there was a lot more space to work with for building a temporary alignment than there would be today. However, I don't think it's really any of these things that's brought us to where we are now, where closing a busy suburban line for multiple months is, apparently, fine. In the past, keeping the trains running was a priority, the priority even. The way projects were managed came from a starting point of, how can this be done without disrupting the railway? And the planning went outward from there. Engineers and planners went in with that mindset and they had to make it work. These days, while running replacement buses can be quite complex, the decision to use them is an easy one to make. We even have a dedicated fleet of buses for this purpose because it happens so often. Projects today are planned with that in mind, and the priority of maintaining the service has all but vanished. The only time keeping trains running sometimes remains a priority today is on lines with heavy freight traffic. It takes over 300 trucks a day to replace the steel trains on the Frankston line, for instance, or for lines which provide access to important maintenance facilities. Projects on the Mernda line often get high-effort solutions to keep the line open due to the need to keep Epping workshops accessible. A good recent example was the grade separation at Cian Park, where they built a new elevated section offset and one side at a time, resulting in an interesting period where trains were running on different levels in either direction and keeping the line open for as much as possible, including for all the most important trains. I've been waiting for an excuse to use that shot for ages. But these sorts of solutions are the exception, made for practical reasons rather than any goal of keeping passengers moving. So here in 2025, the attitude towards these massive disruptions is that it's all worth it for progress. Us commuters should just grin and bear it because it's all worth it in the long run. And besides, the service isn't gone, it's been replaced by buses. But it's my view, and the view of anyone who's ever used a replacement bus in Melbourne, that the word replacement is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. I'm not going to go into all the problems with the way bus replacements are run in Melbourne. This is the second video I've made on the topic and not a lot has changed since episode 1, but there's a few pretty significant things about the way they are run which I'd like to re-emphasise here. You might have guessed this, but there's a reason I'm making this video right now. I'm writing this in late March 2025 and the Hurstbridge line has just emerged from 8 full weeks of bus replacements between Heidelberg and Eltham, a rail distance of 13 kilometres. I'm going to focus on this particular occupation a bit because it's one I have personal experience with, but keep in mind this is pretty typical of what these operations look like all around the network. The normal travel time over the whole line from Hurstbridge to the city is just over an hour, but with this occupation, the travel time blew out to at least an hour and a half, often closer to an hour and 50, and I can confirm from experience that occasionally topping 2 hours was definitely a possibility. However, the actual running times are only part of the problem. Let's see if we can plan a trip from one end of the line to the other using Public Transport Victoria's own journey planner. We're going to head off at 4 PM on a weekday. So as you can see, it's giving us several options here, all taking around an hour and 40 minutes, so 40 odd minutes longer than usual. And notice anything odd? No? None of these options suggest actually using the replacement bus service. They're all multi-sector trips using regular bus routes. This first one suggests taking the train to Eltham, then the 902 bus to Doncaster, then the 903 bus to Box Hill, then a Belgrave-Lilydale train into the city. The next suggestion is slightly wilder. It's the 343 bus to Greensborough, then the 514 to Heidelberg, and then, get this, rather than changing directly from the 514 to the train at Heidelberg, it's telling us to get off on Burgundy Street and wait 5 minutes for the 903, catching at the final 300 metres to Heidelberg Station. Option 3 starts out the same as the first one as far as Doncaster, but then suggests taking the 907 to Collingwood and rejoining the railway there. That's obviously just one time sample, but the point is, PTV's own journey planner scrambles to find these roundabout alternatives rather than showing you the replacement service that they themselves are offering. So, why exactly is that? It's not that the journey planner can't show the bus replacements, it's just that it doesn't see them as being competitive enough to recommend. We can get a little clue into what's happening here if we, ironically, turn off buses as an option, which forces the replacement buses to show up, because they just show up as trains. So now we can see why they weren't appearing. According to this, using the replacement bus blows the trip out to over 2 hours, slower than those extremely roundabout routes it was showing before. However, as pessimistic as I was about this service, I wasn't convinced that it's actually quite that slow, so I dug a little deeper. If we look at the breakdown of that trip, it's showing the bus as taking a quite remarkable 1 hour and 3 minutes from Eltham to Heidelberg. Now, the running time of a train stopping all stations between Eltham and Heidelberg is 19 minutes. By road, it's usually around 24 minutes. There are a combination of express and stopping all stations buses over this section, with the express route running fairly directly along Lower Plenty Road, when it's not being blocked by a truck having a lie down, or a Mercedes taking out a set of traffic lights. These aren't just random examples, by the way, they both happened during this occupation. Anyway, with a rough driving time of 24 minutes, if you add in 5 minutes at each end to connect between the train and the bus, the replacement bus service should only add about 15 minutes to the normal travel time. 15, not 50. So, what's happening here is that the express buses aren't in the public timetable at all. The journey planner is working with the times for the stopping buses only. I was still a little suspicious that even the stopping bus could take that long, so I had a closer look at that and noticed that 20 of those 63 minutes are timetabled for the 2.7 kilometre trip from Rosanna to Heidelberg. I'm not a rocket scientist, but I think this timetable is wrong. I don't think that takes 20 minutes. So I went and checked, and yeah, it only takes 6 minutes. I don't know how to say this. This is very bad. I'm not cherry-picking examples either. Every example I could find was like this. The difference between the real-world 6 minutes and the imaginary 20 minutes means this stopping bus doesn't show as making the connection with this train here, even though it actually does, which appears to set back the overall travel time even more. It may even be narrowly possible to make it onto this train. And if the express bus was showing, you'd be at Heidelberg a good 30 minutes earlier than that. Let's just remember the real-life impacts of this kind of thing. Loads of people depend on journey planners like this to get their transport information, and very few people are going to question the accuracy. Most people are going to look at these options and decide that catching public transport just isn't viable on this occasion. I actually had a perfect example of this come up while making this video. My dad had to travel from Eltham to Heidelberg to get to an appointment. He looked at the timetable, saw it was going to take over an hour, and decided there was no point. He ended up driving instead. I'm aware that some people might think that's a perfectly fine solution, but it's really important to acknowledge that lots of people don't have the choice of driving. From teenagers to elderly people to people with certain disabilities, people who live car-free, or even someone like myself. I have a license, but my partner and I share a car. I don't always have access to it. And if everyone who normally uses the train was able to drive, it would actually be a serious problem. You'll never guess what happens when you suddenly add several thousand extra cars to the existing road network at peak hour. While the results from the PTV planner were pretty chaotic, I found the Google Maps journey planner often provided some even crazier alternative trips, and you get the most interesting ones if you want to travel at night, after most of the normal bus routes have stopped running, because people don't go places at night, right? Anyway, if we want to leave the city at 10 PM on a weeknight, we get some very interesting multi-sector trips, including some quite long tram rides. There's this option, which bafflingly suggests going via Springvale, and this scenic journey via Broadmeadows. But the real fun stuff begins if we want to take the very last train of the night, which during the week is at 12 minutes past midnight from Flinders Street. Google thinks that this train doesn't connect with the last replacement bus at Heidelberg, which forces it to generate some truly thrilling suggestions running into the next morning. My favourite might be this one, which is an epic, almost 6-hour odyssey, starting with a 2-minute trip around the Northern Loop to Parliament, then 42 minutes on the 86 tram out to Bundoora, where you have a cosy 4-hour wait at this intersection. In the middle of the night, remember. Then it's on to the first 9:02 bus of the morning to Eltham, where you have a mere 15-minute wait for the 5:41 AM train to Hurstbridge. There's also this similarly inspiring overnighter that somehow manages to go via Brighton, then on to Eltham via 3 buses over 4.5 hours. By the way, I checked, and the last train of the night does connect with a replacement bus, but Google is ignoring that because it doesn't think you'll make the 5-minute connection at Heidelberg, which honestly could be touch and go. The temporary bus stop is about a 3.5-minute walk from the platform for an able-bodied adult. Being the last of the night, they'd probably hold the bus if the train was late, but you'd want to be sure, and there's not much about this operation which inspires that kind of confidence. So the inaccurate and missing timetable information makes the trips look longer than they actually are, but there are more layers to this, as the buses themselves are often delayed quite heavily, and in my experience, it's very common to have the connection time blow out to 15 or more minutes at both ends. So those 40 to 50 additional minutes of travel time are something that does happen, just not quite in the way PTV says it will. With all this in mind, you basically have to assume that any given trip is going to take probably 40 to 50 minutes longer than usual, and I'd probably allow a whole extra hour if you're going somewhere time critical. Let's be clear about exactly what that means. A return trip to the city is going to take at least 90 minutes longer than usual. Realistically, that time will vary with the unpredictable nature of the buses, but if you need to definitely be somewhere at a certain time, it's effectively going to be 2 hours, because you're just going to have to assume it might take that long, even if it doesn't every day. If you work full-time, congratulations, you've just lost 10 hours a week. Let's not forget the occupation I'm talking about went for 8 weeks, so you could easily lose 80 hours of your life to this. Even on a single day, the usefulness of the service plummets when it becomes so much less predictable and takes so much longer. Schools can't run excursions by train because they don't fit into the school day, travelling with small kids becomes exponentially harder, and spontaneous trips become really impractical. Bus replacements also present a whole range of accessibility issues, not least because of the distance between the bus stops and the platforms. At Heidelberg it's about 250 metres, including a long, non-DDA compliant ramp. As someone who often travels with a pram, I can say that taking one on a bus can be really challenging, just because of the way buses move, something that's never an issue on the train, and I know this is a huge challenge for wheelchair users too. Also, by the way, you can't take bikes, dogs or surfboards on the buses, things that are all permitted on trains, so for anyone who normally travels with those items, and I'm particularly thinking about people who use a bike for a last mile connection, you simply can't travel. I assume dogs attempting to travel with surfboards would be double banned. But look, that might be for the best. As a side note, these signs were all still in place the day after the occupation finished, with no indication that the bus stop was no longer active. Hopefully nobody tried waiting there. Okay, so you probably get my point by this stage. Bus replacements provide a shadow of the regular rail service, and for certain people in certain situations, it's not actually viable to use them at all. So, at least the passengers of the Hurstbridge line are getting something out of this 8-week shutdown. Right? Right? Yeah, they're not. It's for a freeway project. The North East Link is currently bulldozing its way through Melbourne's northeast, and it crosses the Hurstbridge line at Watsonia. Yeah, recognise this spot? The North East Link is swallowing up the Greensboro Highway, which the Hurstbridge line was lowered for back in the 70s, with, remember, no significant interruption to trains. This occupation really stands out from others in recent years because of this. It's one of the longest occupations we've ever had. I think it may actually be the longest continuous occupation in the 137-year history of the Hurstbridge line, and we get nothing from it. There were some other works being done to the railway during this shutdown, but that's just taking advantage of the opportunity. There was nothing else going on that would justify such a massive disruption. Despite this being a road project, it didn't stop Victoria's big build from trying to train wash the benefits to rail passengers. The brochures handed out at stations included phrases like this:
"We're upgrading almost 5 kilometres of rail tracks and signalling between Macleod and Greensboro stations to make train services safer and more reliable on the Hurstbridge line."
Let's be absolutely clear here. The upgrades they're talking about are just the changes required to slap a freeway over 500 metres of the line. Implying there are safety or reliability improvements from this is blatantly misleading. New safety equipment is required because of the longer tunnel being built. It's not going to be more or less safe for passengers passing through than it was before the project began, and there aren't any operational or service improvements coming out of this. The signalling upgrade they're talking about was basically just an equipment renewal, and that was completed over a year ago. It wasn't even part of this occupation. I think a point that often gets missed about public transport is that people build their lives around it. And that's something we really need to encourage. Our city is climbing towards 5.5 million people, and reducing car dependency is crucial if we want our city to remain a nice place to live. And, in fact, our planet. When I say people build their lives around public transport, I mean that very literally. The reason I live in the part of the world that I do is because my grandparents chose to live in a suburb with a railway station when they immigrated to Melbourne back in the 1950s, and my family has been in the area ever since. Every job I've ever had and every house I've ever lived in, I've chosen because of their proximity to the rail network. And that's an amazing privilege that we have a transport system that allows me to do that. But when people build their lives around the network, they need to be able to depend on it being there for them when they need it. There's a huge difference between shutting down a service for, say, a long weekend, and what we're seeing today with these occupations that last weeks and weeks. For a long weekend, you can just cancel plans, maybe take a day or two off work or school, and just avoid having to travel entirely. But when we start talking about multiple weeks, that's the sort of thing that can make employment or education unviable. While I'm not currently a daily commuter, I've been through this in the past, working in jobs where it wasn't possible to take time off or work from home, and losing tens of hours of my life to bus replacements as a result. And for some people, this could literally make employment impossible if the extra time and uncertain scheduling means they can't get back from work or study in time to do a school pickup, for instance. I'm well aware that there will be some people watching this from other cities who think 8 weeks doesn't actually sound that long. I'm thinking of the people of Adelaide's Gawler line, who endured 18 months of bus replacements in 2021-22, users of the Carlingford line in Sydney, who recently copped a whole 5 years of buses while their railway was converted into a tram line, and of course the people of Sydney's Bankstown line, which is, as we speak, partway through an occupation that's due to last at least 12 months, probably more, while their line is converted into a metro. While I can't speak to the quality of the replacement service in those places, I want to acknowledge that while 8 weeks is enough to make people's lives really difficult, when we start talking over a year, that is some seriously life-changing stuff. There'd be people who would have to quit jobs or just not get them in the first place, and especially for renters, it wouldn't surprise me if there are people who have been forced to move house because of some of these projects. These sorts of personal costs, financial or otherwise, simply don't appear to be a consideration for the authorities planning these things. Back at Watsonia, I'm not an engineer. I can't say for sure that there was a less disruptive way of doing this particular project, other than my personal preference of just not building the freeway, of course. However, my rough crayon suggestion would be building the rail underpass as a new alignment slightly to the east of the existing line. I don't think you'd need to acquire any private property, and you could do it in 2 halves to keep the road open, then just fill in the old cutting afterwards. I went and had a look at the site once trains had started running again, and this just reinforced what I thought. Just eyeballing it, there's plenty of space to work with, and actually the work done to the railway in preparation for burying it under the freeway basically involved all new construction anyway. I don't know that it would have cost that much more to build it parallel. You'd still need some occupations, but not 8 weeks worth. I wasn't initially going to include this idea in the video because I thought people would just shout it down as being too expensive, and I'm sure they still will, but this is a $26 billion freeway project. Putting the extra effort in here would be a drop in the ocean in the scheme of things, and there'd also be cost savings in not having to run a temporary bus route for 2 months. I'm well aware it's no longer the 70s. We even make construction workers wear clothes now, and I don't think we can go all the way back to never needing replacement buses again. But I do think we can surely find a better balance if keeping trains moving is a priority right from the design stage with these projects. And when we do have bus replacements, it'd be really great if PTV could publish the actual timetable so we can plan our trips. Like, that would be really great. I'd really enjoy that. Please do that next time. I normally like to end my videos on something positive, and honestly it was a challenge for this one, but I do want to point out that there is one thing bus replacements are really good for, and that's bus spotting. The fleet used for these operations is really diverse and eccentric, with most of the buses carrying partly stripped liveries from previous operators. I don't really know anything about buses, but I can see there's a lot to find interesting here. I'm pretty sure these silver buses are ex-Perth, for instance. What's the deal with this yellow one? I noticed this orange bus has a name, Romeo and Juliet, which seems fitting. Waiting for a replacement bus can feel a lot like that play's final scene. If any proper bus enthusiasts would like to fill us in on any interesting details of these vehicles down in the comments, I'd love to hear from you. Anyway, that's it. I'm done. I'm going to go ride a train now before the line closes again for the next part of the project. Yeah, they're not done yet. Thanks as always to my patrons for allowing me to spend time working on these videos, and thank you very much for watching.
All change. This train not taking passengers. We've arranged replacement services. Alternative transport has been arranged. All change. This train not taking passengers.